Okay, so let's go through the anatomy of the nephron. And let's talk about how the nephron actually helps us control blood pressure later though. So we'll start off with this. Structure over here. Now, we know that we have a network of capillaries that are actually bringing a filtrate or blood to be filtered by the nephron. And we know that we call this network of capillaries the glomerulus. Now, within the glomerular capillaries, we have the cells of the kidney that have end feet. And these here just go through that blood, that fenestrated endothelium, and kind of check what needs to go back into the bloodstream and what actually needs to be part of the filtrate so that the nephron can actually sort it out. So then this glomerulus is met by this structure here, and this structure here is what we know as the Bowman's capsule. Now, an important point here to note is that when you have a glomerulus plus a Bowman's capsule, you end up with something called a renal corpuscle. So, the Bowman capsule then ends up as this first convoluted tubule, and this convoluted tubule is what we call the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, in the proximal convoluted tubule, we have a lot of reabsorption to do, and we want to do this at an efficient pace. So the cells that we find in the walls of the proximal convoluted tubule are cuboidal cells that are actually specialized in that they have microvilli. And we know that microvilli is going to increase surface area and therefore increase reabsorption. So here we have cuboidal cells with microvilli. So whenever you have microvilli, you have an increase in surface area, therefore you have an increase in reabsorption. But reabsorption of what? Well, we need to reabsorb 100% of the glucose that enters the filtrate. We need to reabsorb some sodium, some chloride, and we know that whenever we have reabsorption of sodium chloride, we know that water will always follow that. So now we get to the next part of the nephron, which is that loop of Henle and the descending and ascending limbs, respectively. So here, well, not respectively, actually, irrespectively. We have the descending limb here, we have that loop of Henle, and here we have the ascending limb. Now, similar to the proximal convoluted tubule, we are reabsorbing water, and therefore we are reabsorbing sodium chloride. And some other substances as well, but not that important to note for the purposes of the unit. So now we end up in our distal, so all of this is our distal convoluted tubule. And then after the distal convoluted tubule, we get the collecting duct. Okay, now just to orientate you on the actual arterioles that are coming from or that are ending up in the glomerular capillaries, we have that afferent arteriole over here. And that's going towards the glomerulus. And then we have an efferent arteriole exiting away from that glomerulus. Now, if we just go back to the proximal convoluted tubule again and have a look at the cells that we find in the walls, we have those cuboidal cells with the microvilli. Now, we expect in a non-pathological nephron that the proximal convoluted tubules will do a lot of the reabsorption. So that by the time the filtrate actually gets to the distal convoluted tubule, we don't need to do as much reabsorption. Therefore, we don't need that microvilli on the cells anymore. So these here are now those cuboidal cells with no microvilli. So here and here we have cuboidal cells, no microvilli. But what we also call these cells are the principal cells, because we have something else. We have cells that we call the intercalated cells. So over here. And what these cells are, or what they do, is really important because they help control the blood pH, in that they reabsorb or secrete, whoops, can't pick a color, either bicarbonate or secrete it, or hydrogen. So, in other words, if your blood is too acidic or it's not alkaline enough, you will secrete a lot of hydrogen. But if your blood is too acidic, you'll reabsorb a lot of bicarbonate so that you can neutralize the pH of the blood. Now, that is a very simple schematic of what actually happens in the anatomy of the nephron. But how does the nephron actually control blood pressure? Well, good question. We have something called the Juxtaglomerular apparatus. Now, this juxtaglomerular apparatus has three things in it. We have, first, the juxtaglomerular cells. Now, these juxtaglomerular cells are embedded within the wall of the afferent arteriole. So over here, we have the juxtaglomerular cells, and these cells are actually baroreceptors. So, in other words, when you have blood going through the afferent arteriole and you don't have as much as usual, in other words, your blood pressure has decreased, these baroreceptors detect this and start to release an enzyme called renin. And we will get to what renin does in a second. So we have renin. Now, what the other type of cell is our, macular denser cells. And these macular denser cells, these are actually found in the walls of the distal convoluted tubules. So over here, we have the macular denser cells. And what these cells are, these here are chemoreceptors, meaning that they monitor the concentration of sodium chloride going through the nephron. So, if these macular denser cells are chemoreceptors and they monitor the concentration of sodium chloride, and remembering that water will always follow sodium chloride, if there's a dip or if there's a decrease in sodium chloride concentration, there's also a decrease in water volume. So what these cells do, they communicate to the juxtaglomerular cells via a connective tissue layer, which is that third component, and stimulate the juxtaglomerular cells to also release renin. Now, with renin, what happens when the juxtaglomerular cells produce it is that it actually bypasses the whole glomerulus and goes straight out to that efferent arteriole into systemic circulation. So if we go out and we go out to another vessel over here and we chuck in renin, we put her in there, and let's see what happens with renin in the bloodstream. But we also need the liver. Now, the liver is actually releasing something into the bloodstream that we know, or that we call, angiotensinogen. Now, when renin and angiotensinogen meet, something happens. So we put a plus sign there. But before we go to that, what does the word angio mean? Well, when you get an angiogram, it is you getting imaging of your blood vessels, or a radiographic image of your blood vessels. Tensin is to tense, and OGN is an inactive form of angiotensinogen. So what renin does is it chops off this OGN and activates the angiotensinogen to become angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin 1 clinically, not that relevant because it actually doesn't constrict the vessels that much or that significantly relative to angiotensin 2. Now, the way that we get angiotensin 2 is that this angiotensin 1 will travel to the lungs, and within the lungs, we find something called an angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. And this converts the angiotensin 1 to an angiotensin 2. So this angiotensin 2 now will have a cascade of effects to increase our blood pressure in response to stimuli that are telling the body that there is a decrease in blood pressure. So this is basically to maintain homeostasis. So if I go to the next page and talk about the effects of angiotensin 2. So what happens first is that we constrict the efferent arterioles and therefore increase glomerular filtration. In other words, if we go back to this nephron, if we're actually constricting this efferent arteriole, making its wall narrower, you'll have a lot more clogging up in that afferent arteriole, and therefore that glomerular rate or glomerular filtration rate is increased. And then we have a hormonal effect. We have the release of the antidiuretic hormone plus aldosterone, which will increase blood volume by increasing the reabsorption of water, but will also have a behavioral effect in that we stimulate thirst. And by stimulating thirst, we stimulate drinking behavior, so we drink water, therefore we increase water intake and therefore increase blood volume as well. And as a result, we increase in blood pressure as well.